Welcome to the Design for Impact podcast. I'm Cara Prosser, an Aussie in London, an experienced designer and strategist obsessed with fixing the world's most broken systems.
And I'm Philip Lockwood-Holmes, an Englishman in Edinburgh, not New York. I work with leaders and organizations helping to turn good intentions into real-world impact. We are your hosts as we meet some of the world's most ambitious thinkers, builders, and changemakers who are redesigning the systems that shape our lives.
From ethical AI and climate innovation to women's rights, healthcare, and humanitarian work, each episode dives into the real stories behind people doing the hard, meaningful work of change. But at its core, we're exploring how can you use design and creativity for impact. Hi, Xenya. Welcome to the Design for Impact podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Cara.
We've been super excited about this conversation, and I think to get into it, we'd love to hear about you. Tell us about your background and your role at the UN.
So my name is Xenya Scanlon, and I have been working for more than 20 years actually at the intersection of sustainability issues, global health, environment. And part of that time indeed has been working with the United Nations. At the moment, I'm leading communications, external relations and partnerships at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, which is actually a global treaty that deals with land. And not only land, but also drought, which we have seen, of course, increasing in the past decades. And the issues that are connected to land really have implications for our planet, but also for our people. So this is a global treaty that brings together 196 governments in the European Union, trying to solve these issues together.
It's such a hugely important space. And I know that you and I, for the listeners and for Philip, Xenia and I worked together on a big program of work to combat malaria. And I think the last time we actually saw each other in person, Xenia, was in Johannesburg, I think. So
that's right.
Where are you today? Where are you at the moment recording this?
Today I'm at my home in Switzerland, just outside of Geneva. The headquarters of UNCCD are based in Bonn, and of course our work takes us to very far-flung places around the world. And for instance, just last month I was in Mongolia, which will be the country that will host the next Conference of the Parties of the UNCCD, so the COPs that you might have heard about from the climate process and elsewhere. So this is going to be the big moment for the international community to come together in support of land.
And it's so hugely important. I know another thing that you and I really connected over is being Australian, and you spent a lot of time in Australia. And I think, growing up in Australia, drought is just, we're so familiar with it, right? Because it's such a dry country. And in growing up, it was always, from what I can remember, there was always water restrictions. You could never have a bath over that much. You could never water the garden. And so that kind of idea of drought and preserving the land and things like that is sort of quite familiar. So I'm just so fascinated by the work that you do. And we've got so many exciting questions for you. But tell us a little bit more around the UNCCD, what your goals are for the future and some of your key initiatives that you're driving at the moment.
Well, absolutely. And first of all, let me also just mention that I didn't grow up in Australia, but for me, it was a big shock actually moving from Europe to Australia in my 20s. And the first thing that people really started paying attention to when I moved to Sydney was the level of the dam. Yeah. And of course, when your city is supplied by increasingly, infrequent rainfall, that was definitely a big realization that indeed, the droughts are here and they're striking harder and harder, but also the fact that we do depend on healthy land for our well-being. And obviously it is the food that we eat, it is very often the clothes that we wear, and I think we will talk about it a little bit later. But it's also the way of life and the sustenance and part of cultural identity that, of course, is very strongly linked to, where we come from. So the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification is really looking at how we can sustain land for the benefit of our communities, of our economies, and the planet overall. We know that at the moment, very sadly, healthy land is being degraded at alarming rates. Every year, we're losing an amount of healthy land that is roughly equivalent to the size of Egypt. So if you think about that, we're on a very dangerous trajectory. But the flip side is that we know that by restoring land back to health, we can actually improve our food systems, we can improve the outcomes for the climate, we can, more effectively prevent global warming and temperatures rising to unsustainable levels. We can also safeguard those very precious and important habitats for wildlife. So investing in healthy land does bring a lot of environmental and social returns, but not least economic returns too, because every dollar that is invested in restoring land brings back 7 to 30 in various benefits. So this is one of the objectives. How can we restore an estimated 1.5 billion hectares of degraded lands today by the year 2030 and beyond? And this is the challenge that we've got. And again, I'm throwing in a lot of big numbers there, but just to, again, put it in perspective, this is the area of China and the US combined. So this is what we need to do to really set ourselves up on a path that would be a more sustainable path for our growing populations.
I mean, it's just a staggering number. How do we even get there? What sort of initiatives do we need to do to kind of reclaim land in that way?
Well, some of the approaches are very high-tech, but some of the approaches are actually found in tradition and what people have been doing for centuries, from really using the right types of plants and trees and shrubs, and sometimes it might be trees, sometimes it might be something else, to managing water resources more wisely. Sometimes it is about allowing for some forms of land use, such as grazing, to take place intermittently between, planting crops and then using the lands for something else. So these are very, let's say it's an array of approaches, and some of them, of course, are inspired by new technologies, but some of them are found in the traditional know-how.
And, a lot of the work that you do is really driving awareness around what's happening, what we need to do, why our land is so important to us as societies, even for the the cities, the great cities of the world. So would love to hear a little bit more around those. So let's start with the rangelands and caravans initiative that you're working on. I love this idea.
So indeed, this year is the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists that has been declared by the United Nations. And you may know rangelands by many different names. Sometimes it's called steppes, sometimes they're called prairies, sometimes they're called tundra, savanna. So these are areas that actually cover half of the world's terrestrial surface. But what is less known is these are the areas that are disappearing sometimes faster than the rainforest, but it's not received the same level of attention globally. So what we're trying to do is to shine the spotlight on rangelands and the custodians of these rangelands, the pastoralists. And there are 2 billion people who depend on rangelands for various needs, livelihoods, food, you name it, around the world. So what we're trying to do is to have a symbolic and physical journey that would connect Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, which was the host of the previous conference of the parties of UNCCD, to the upcoming one in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And in embarking on this journey, which will actually start this month, and it will start in Turkey, which again is a place where a lot of cultures and traditions and civilizations have met. It will traverse a number of countries, really trying to reconnect that spirit of journey, the spirit of collective action, and the spirit, hopefully, of investing more in the health of rangelands, but also sustaining the populations that do depend on them.
I absolutely love it. I think it's phenomenal. And Xenia, you're one of the best storytellers I've actually ever worked with. And so tell us a little bit more. This is about, this podcast is about design for impact, creativity for impact. And I think, as we spoke about before, this episode in particular is really about sort of like campaigning for impact and campaigning for good. So can you give us a little sneak peek, I guess, into some of your process into kind of creating these ideas and coming up with these concepts, like the idea of a caravan sort of going across sort of all of these lands is so interesting. What do you have any thinking frameworks, or what's the process that you go to kind of land on these campaigns and these concepts?
Well, thanks very much, Karen. Again, I really enjoyed us creating Zero Malaria campaign together some years back. And to me, and again, I really love the idea of the podcast, Design for Good. Ultimately, it is indeed something that we're all trying to do in various ways. And to me, creativity has always been a key part of what we're trying to do to change public perspectives and actually effect change on the ground. So how do I go about it? Sometimes it is an inspiration. And to me, for instance, with the Silk Road Caravan, it was an idea of really how can we show that, there is a forward movement. It is about pastoralists, people who have been moving for centuries, for generations across such vast distances. And along with those movements, we have seen how cultures, sort of get into contact with one another. How do we really bring innovations from one place to the next? If you think about even um, some of the stops along the journey, such as Samarkand and Uzbekistan, that has been a traditional sort of hub for innovation. And at a time when we weren't as conveniently linked by air travel or any modern ways of transport. It was through caravans, and it was through people who were, just eager to learn and share, and just do something adventurous. So I guess, that spirit of adventure, that spirit of doing something that is not your usual, sort of press release is what drives me. And in everything that I'm doing, I'm trying to see what is it that would really get people excited, engaged, and give that sense of wonder that I think is very important in what we do.
Incredible. It's such a cool initiative. Something else that you've been working on that I know you're super passionate about as well is Herland. So tell us a little bit about Herland and what's behind that. Such an important initiative that you guys are driving.
Thank you, Kara. And the starting point there was, again, just looking at some of the dry statistics, but the statistics that really tell a story of profound inequalities. Because at the moment in the world, we've got women who represent half the world's population, who produce nearly half the world's food, but at the same time, they own less than 1/5 of the world's land. And not only that, but in more than 100 countries, women continue to face legal or sometimes cultural barriers in terms of accessing that land. For instance, during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, some women lost access to their land because their husbands or their fathers have passed away and they didn't have a formal means of inheriting that land. And with it, this is the livelihoods that they have. So through Herland, what we're trying to do is to mobilize again creativity, powerful voices of artists, musicians, prominent personalities, politicians, public figures, to really say that, we need to do better and we need to empower women through better laws, through better access to finance, and through support to these women-led initiatives, be it on drought resilience or land restoration or better food security for their communities, because we know that it makes a huge difference for their families, for their communities, and for countries at large. Women, when given the opportunity, can significantly improve the nutrition of their families and communities. They can improve health outcomes. They can improve education for their children and so much more, because it's ultimately, investing in women is investing in our societies.
And I love that example because when we think about human-centered design and creative thinking, it's all about connecting with the end user and really getting to the root cause of the problem, right? And because with that initiative, you're actually going in and supporting governments to change laws and to change legislation, right? To ensure that women can have ownership of their land, essentially. Is that what's happening?
Yes, what we try to do is to engage really decision makers, be it governments, be it parliamentarians, be it international organizations, so that they actually think about this aspect when they're making laws and when they are implementing projects. So it's really try to act at many levels, international, but also, of course, engaging with countries. and also showcasing what can be done and what are some of the inspiring examples of women, girls, their connection to land, and their leadership in many situations, and sometimes against great odds.
So fantastic. So then the third initiative I'm going to ask you about, and then I'm going to hand over to Philip to ask some questions, some interesting questions as well, is this concept of fashion for land and the, I guess, awareness you're trying to get in the fashion space, and why that connection to UNCCD is so important.
Hi, Philip, and lovely to speak with you. And actually, last time I was in Edinburgh was because there was a convening dedicated to sustainable fashion, and it was really in the context of the work that I lead on fashion for land. It's been actually now around 15 years, I dare say, that I have been involved in this area. And really, I started as a trailblazer at a time when not many people knew what sustainable fashion meant. And just seeing that area mature and develop and become so much more mainstream is very gratifying, because it's ultimately, how do we produce, how do we consume clothes, what kind of difference we can make as individuals, but also as part of, international organizations, sometimes corporations, sometimes, other structures, in making sure that the fashion industry uh, becomes a force for good. And we are all consumers of fashion, whether we like it or not, some with more gusto than others, perhaps, but still, we do wear clothes. So our individual choices have to be informed. And ultimately, we as consumers do have also a way and the opportunity to really make those choices in a mindful way, and also to prioritize something that maybe wasn't part of our thinking just a few years ago. Let me give you an example, for instance, of wool. At the moment, wool, which again, Scotland is very famous for, so is Australia, is a fiber that only represents 1% of all clothes mix. So if you look at the amount of clothes out there in the world, more than 60% is polyester, and then it's about 20 to 25% cotton, but wool is only 1%. So if we stop wearing clothes made out of wool, we might have sort of again a situation where livelihoods and the know-how that are associated with this fiber may no longer be needed or may disappear. So what we're trying to do is through Fashion for Land is, first of all, to look at the various fibers and their impact on land and water resources, but also to orient a little bit the overall fashion system to make it more sustainable. And again, this is a work that is not done by ourselves alone. We are working as part of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. And again, it's an area which I'm personally very passionate about. I am a big believer in trying to make better choices through what we wear. So we hope to be able to contribute to this discussion, including so by showcasing some of the better ways in which our clothes can be made, and also innovations that exist in this field. I sometimes use the examples of say startups that transform orange peels into silk-like materials. So that was
Wow.
again, one of those innovations that has proven that it could be done, it could be scaled up, and there are other examples that again look at the growing problem of textile waste around the world, and also look at better ways of producing fibers without depleting our water and land resources.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think, this is something that I have been quite interested in over the last few years. So I am, you might not believe it from what I'm looking like, relatively fashion conscious in terms of what I buy and what I wear. And it's an area whereby I have tried to make better choices. But over the last 3 years, the more I read about land use and production, there are so many complex interlinked pieces, right? So for example, wool. I've looked at a little bit from a land use perspective, and in terms of kind of sheep, in terms of food production, lamb isn't what I've seen brilliant from a carbon and land use perspective, but then it's then thinking about the impact on livelihoods and and society and communities, right? All of these things are so interlinked that they get very, very complicated. So, yeah, it's brilliant that we've got an organization looking at the whole system of food and textiles and clothing and desertification and all kind of connecting those things together.
Indeed. And as you said, we have a lot of various elements that need to be taken into account. Livelihoods, definitely jobs that are associated with the production of food, fiber, and so many other things. But ultimately, what we want to also see, I guess, is that whole system that is done in a way that is more circular, more sustainable, and ultimately supporting the way of life, but also supporting the broader environmental objectives.
Yeah, and I think it's from a communications and a branding perspective, all of my kind of professional, maybe more corporate experience tells me that you need to make the point really clear and really too easy to understand, and that actually what happens is sometimes the complexity of doing the right thing gets lost. So I mean, I talk to people a lot, and they want to plant a tree. Well, which tree, where tree, and how to look after it, sustain it, it all becomes quite complex and interlinked, right? But there's this idea that planting a tree is a good thing. Well, it is in the right place with the right community at the right time, and that's where buying one item of clothing over another, it's all a compromise and a payoff between two different things, isn't it?
Indeed, and I would say that it's definitely a communications conundrum. How do you, on the one hand, make the information accessible and simple enough to absorb without sort of dumbing it down or without giving such simplistic recommendations that, indeed you end up with the wrong tree in the wrong place, or, sort of saying, you should do this and not that without taking into account some other considerations, including, sort of the proximity of certain resources, or, is it better to have a fruit that has traveled halfway around the world before you put it on your plate, or choosing something that comes from a nearby orchard. I would also say that in the area of fashion in particular, that is one reflection that I've had, because even in terms of consumer labels, we're overwhelmed with various certifications where we don't even know what this or that label means, any longer. So yes, there is a strong case for simplifying things, making them more streamlined, and also making sure that behind those labels we also have a strong system that would support certain claims. So I think this is part of the reason why we need to work on this collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big believer in some of those certifications that you see on products that you can believe and trust, that help a consumer make a quick decision. I guess also, and I know these aren't the questions I'm supposed to be asking yet, and I'll come on to them in a minute, but earlier when you were talking about the Silk Road project, the caravan, I was thinking what a brilliant story and initiative that is. And I thought the challenge is, how do you cut through with that story when it might be quite nuanced and there's quite a lot of richness to it. And in a culture where we find out that shock, horror, and hatred get through much quicker, how do you work in that context to make sure that your stories are told? Are there any kind of tips that anyone listening could learn from the way that you do this?
The Silk Road Caravan, as I mentioned, is only embarking this month. We hope that it's going to be a very smooth and successful journey. I really, really hope so. We've already had a number of considerations that had to be taken into account, not least in terms of, crossing various borders, because apparently, in the centuries past, people who had traveled those distances did not always have to carry passports and visas and everything else. So, that is obviously something that we're hoping will go smoothly. And generally speaking, to me, how do you cut through the noise? It is by showing something that ultimately to me is either unusual or hasn't been done before, or something that just inspires hope and awe. And through this journey, we're going to be traveling through so many iconic sites, including World Heritage sites and other, sort of just incredibly diverse landscapes and parts of the world that, maybe not many people have had an opportunity to travel across. So showing that and translating that into real experiences of people who live in these places and telling their stories is what we seek to achieve through this journey, and again motivate those who are in the position of making important decisions on the future of these landscapes and on the future of these communities would also be equally inspired and actually justly proud of those varied cultural traditions and know-how in terms of environmental management. Because as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of the solutions on how to be more sustainable are found in the experiences of the communities that do it day in, day out.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. Yeah, and I was actually thinking, so I worked for a climate tech for a couple of years, the last couple of years, and we were looking at, desertification isn't a big issue in Scotland, but we were looking at how green solutions can be there instead of concrete solutions. So, how can you cut down on flood risk by replanting trees and moving hedgerows to the right place, and, natural solutions to some of the problems that we've created as humanity in the world. Yeah, brilliant.
And I would say that also, although, for instance, the UK is not maybe the first country impacted by desertification, but land degradation does
Yes.
affect, all countries, and drought we're seeing also is increasingly affecting a lot of countries that haven't experienced it to the same extent before. But what is taking hold is that idea of natural capital in investing in that natural infrastructure. And I think this is, again, something that hopefully will prove to be a scalable solution in the UK and beyond, and that we can really see those examples of, better land management contributing to, greater water security, greater energy security, sort of a better just health outcomes. Again, we know that when we've got a healthy environment, people's health also benefits.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about that commercial part, where does the commercial conversation fit in here in terms of, there's things like carbon credits based on nature, carbon credits, there's kind of biodiversity, bonds, these kind of things. Where does that fit into some of the work that you do?
So innovative finance is a big part, of course, of trying to see how we can leverage the ingenuity and the capacity of the private sector to really contribute to the shared challenges that we have. For us, what we do is work through the initiative called Business for Land, which is again an initiative that is specifically targeting the private sector and financial institutions in a way that we realize that we've got a huge gap. We need about $1 billion a day to ensure, that land is restored back to health and that we continue to enjoy the benefits that it brings. And we have a huge financial gap between what we have currently going in investments and financing towards, land restoration and drought resilience compared to what we need. So what we're trying to do is to mobilize exactly the ingenuity of the private sector and financial institutions in creating those opportunities, whether it's through blended finance, whether it's through leveraging ESG investments and so on. I'm not an expert on carbon credits, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those. But just to say that, of course, everything that we need to do to orient the system to be more supportive, and the private sector in particular to be more supportive towards healthy land, will have benefits for the sustainability of those businesses themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say things that you can't say because you obviously work for a UN organization. But, therefore we have a lot of the economic system that is set up to benefit those that are extracting wealth and not paying the costs for some of that extraction. So, brilliant that you and the team and so many people are telling the stories and laying out the issues that we have to face. But there's a lot we need to do in terms of systems change, isn't there, to make progress?
Well, absolutely. I mean, be it the economic systems or sometimes, sort of the broader governance systems, we do have sometimes situations where we don't have that enabling environment for us to be able to, do what's needed to be done for sustainable land management. And again, this is a big part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess before no, not I'm going to edit this question out. Absolutely. And I know that in the past you worked with Cara in terms of looking at malaria, and that was a role you had before. Is there an intersection between land use and health, and how does that fit together?
Well, actually, I found that when I started working on malaria and then started working on desertification, that there was a huge, huge overlap in terms of the countries that were both negatively impacted by deadly diseases such as malaria and the impacts of desertification, drought, land degradation. The impacts are many and varied, and indeed it ranges from things like, sort of waterborne diseases when you don't have, the clean and safe water, and that again, has a lot to do with the health of the land, to diseases such as zoonosis that become much more common when land becomes degraded, when forests get chopped down, or the human development encroaches on previously less accessible areas. That's where you get, again, diseases that can jump from one species to another, and we all, all know all that well what that when that happens, what can happen in terms of global health outcomes. And last but not least, phenomena such as sand and dust storms, which again you may or may not heard about, but these are very common storms that happen in the Sahel, that happen in the Middle East and other parts of the world that uh, actually transport an equivalent of 300 pyramids of Giza worth of sand and dust across, sometimes countries and continents. They can also lead to things like eye infections, meningitis in some cases. So there is a clear link, and that's why there is this concept of one health when we're not talking about only human health, but we're also talking about environmental health in the same vein.
And
Yeah.
Xenia, can you talk a little bit about the connection between land and mental health, particularly in communities? I think it's so interesting when we spoke about that the other week.
So, in particular, I would say this relates to the topic of drought. And we have seen that in many countries, drought has had particularly significant mental health impacts on the communities, as we know that in a number of countries, suicides really are particularly concentrated in farming communities, and very often it is because of just sheer desperation after so many years of failed, rains that people even in very advanced, economically advanced countries are facing this growing issue. And of course, drought in itself means that, for instance, women very often, again, it's very often women and girls in developing countries have to walk longer distances to fetch water. And when that happens, unfortunately, it is also linked to increase in violence.
Yeah.
And sometimes, sort of sexual violence against women. So this is a very multidimensional topic. Again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not qualified to give, sort of either medical advice or very clear statistics. But these are some of the trends that have been observed indeed in research, and this is something that again makes us even more aware of the importance of tackling some of these environmental issues. Again, drought sometimes leads, unfortunately, to a greater number of girls being married prematurely. So these are, again, some of the impacts that we might not instinctively think about in the first instance, but this is what's happening as a result of this very slow onset, but highly impactful disaster.
It's so interconnected, isn't it?
Mm.
Healthy planet, healthy people. Xenia, you've been absolutely incredible. You were literally like your brain's like an encyclopedia. All the statistics that you that you told us about, just incredible, really mind-blowing actually. And I think one of my favorite parts of this episode has been you talking about to really cut through, to have kind of unusual ideas and ideas that haven't been done before. And I think that that's a real takeaway for our listeners, particularly in this kind of as the robots are taking over, as you know. So I really loved that concept. But I think as we wrap up, what's one thing you'd really love the listeners to take away or remember from our episode today?
Thank you very much. And I have been thinking about what would be that, one thing that I feel very strongly about. And to me, ultimately, it's the intersection between creativity and message. Because to me, we can cite all the statistics out there in the world, whether or not they're going to make as big of an impact as somebody who is sharing those very messages through song or through poetry or through something visual or something creative, something fashionable, something that really makes us stop and wonder. And I love that intersection of art and environment, for instance. I love the intersection between, global health and what we were doing with zero malaria. It's just creating that energy and drumbeat around some of these very, sometimes very depressing and devastating issues, but turning them into a conversation that people don't just feel like, oh, it's too much doom and gloom, I want to switch off, I don't want to think about it, but into a conversation that will ultimately help us do better.
And how can people follow along? How can we follow the caravan? How can we, learn more about what you're doing? How can we see? Because it's also a very visual, beautiful campaign you did for all the Herland work. So where can people go to see all this and to keep up to date with what you're doing and be part of it?
Oh, we've got websites for the caravan with hopefully very regular daily updates from the journey. And we hope that it will also be turned into a longer documentary at the end of it. So silkroadcaravan.org is the website. We also have a website for her land campaign, again, herland.org. And obviously for all the things you wanted to know about land, drought, desertification, and the work of UNCCD, you can go to unccd.int and learn more.
Fantastic. And we'll share those links when we publish the episode as well. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure.